Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Mind Muscle Connection podcast. Today is a solo episode, and I want to do something a little different today. I want to go over some studies that I've just found interesting, and they're all going to apply to body composition, nutrition, stuff like that. Just want to go over that. Give me some feedback here. Let me know if you kind of these styles of episodes every once in a while. I'd like to usually pick one main topic, but felt like this would be a cool thing to do every once in a while here. So just let me know. Also, if you are interested in body recomp, you know what it is, how to do it, different types, the benefits of it. And then again, really the main things you need to do to achieve that. Then my free body recomp checklist is for you. And the link to that is in the show notes. And again, it's completely free. So let me know if you have any questions on it, but go and check that out. All right. So again, I have 4 studies I want to go over today. And so the first one is around what to do after a meal. Okay. A study titled The Effects of Postprandial Walking on the Glucose Response After Meals with Different Characteristics. So from my understanding, they had 4 different kind of groups here, right? So you had oral glucose tolerance test, and they didn't move after. Then you had another group that did the same thing, but they did movement afterwards. And then you had a meal, same thing, they didn't move afterwards. And then the other group had a meal and they exercised after. And what they found is that a 30-minute walk starting just around 15 minutes after eating significantly reduced post-meal blood glucose spikes, regardless of whether the meal was high carb or mixed in macros, right? Because the OGTT, the oral glucose tolerance test, is basically just straight glucose, right? Whereas the meal was mixed. Okay. And either way, movement after that meal lowered blood glucose there. And we don't want to necessarily get overly caught up in always having the lowest, like we just don't want to get too caught up in blood sugar control and what happens after we eat a meal is more so what I'm saying, right? And we eat certain things, if you're stressed, like this is going to raise that blood glucose response afterwards. And again, generally speaking, I guess I shouldn't say we don't want to care at all, but we don't have to be neurotic about keeping it low, right? That's where a lot of people will get like a monitor, and anything that spikes it up or brings it up, people are like, oh, I can't eat that type of food. Because like I said, yes, the type of food can increase it, but then also, and again, these are going to be foods that are usually higher in like carbohydrates and sugar and like lower in fats and protein and stuff like that. But again, stress, poor sleep, like all these things can impact that response. So we need to take it with a grain of salt. And again, there's going to be some foods that maybe spike it more than others for certain people. So the timing at which you take these meals are all going to be things that play a role in it. And again, generally speaking, we don't want it to get super high, but the big thing being how long is it super high? If it just spikes up and your body's able to clear it super quick, that's again, like I said, though, we do want to make sure that we're not constantly getting it super high, because that means we could probably work on one of those things that I just talked about. But the problem becomes when it stays elevated for extended periods of time. So again, we want to have some combination of limiting how high it gets, but again, we need to look at frequency of that and then how long it stays elevated, right? The higher it gets, the longer it stays elevated, that's where you're going to run into some more issues. And it's a good sign that, your body's not very good at regulating blood sugar. And there's some things that we can work on from a lifestyle perspective, nutrition perspective, training perspective, et cetera, right? And so again, when we're able to reduce this kind of post-meal spike, it's going to mean better blood sugar control, fewer crashes, improved appetite regulation, and long-term metabolic benefits, which in turn is going to improve your body composition over time, as long as we're still doing the other things as well too, right? And as one benefit, right? If we're like this is going to be a great way to manage. People talk about what their glucose is on their blood work, A1C, fasting insulin, things like that. And these are things that you could do that can help support that, right? So we know that it's going to give you better, right? You eat, you go for a movement afterwards, better blood sugar control. And in turn, if we can manage our blood sugar better, that's going to help improve our body composition. So I think generally speaking, from that standpoint, that's a benefit. But getting some movement in post-meal can also do a couple other things. One, it can help support digestion, right? If we're up, everything flows down. So it's like, that's going to allow things to move through you much better, right? So it's going to support healthy digestion. And it can help reduce bloating and or sluggishness, right? So anytime maybe you don't feel great after a meal, it's like getting up and moving. And again, it doesn't have to be like a run or anything, but getting up and moving can be super helpful from that perspective. And then lastly, the third thing it does is it's just going to help you bank in more daily steps without it feeling like a chore, right? So it's a way to add your just total movement into the day. I know for me personally, I always feel better when I move after a meal, even if it's just a quick 10 minutes, but not always perfect with that. And so that's definitely something I've tried to incorporate. And again, when clients come in, we're talking about body composition, we're talking about if they do have maybe a little bit higher glucose, or they've been diagnosed with, say, like insulin resistance, or they need to manage their blood sugar, and or if they're dealing with some gut health issues. This is like hey, we're going to do this. And so I think generally it's a thing that everybody should do, but especially if you're experiencing those things, this can be a really good tool in the toolbox there. If anybody has any thoughts on this, I'd love to hear from you on that if it's something you incorporate, but definitely would look into doing that if you're experiencing any of that stuff there. All right, so that's the first study. Next one is elevated ghrelin, which ghrelin is the hunger hormone, predicts food intake during experimental sleep restriction. So this study found that people who were sleep deprived didn't necessarily eat significantly more at meals. Like it was very similar. They looked at lunch and dinner and pretty similar in terms of the caloric intake, right? But what they did do when they didn't get great sleep was they snacked more throughout the day. Okay. So I've talked a lot about sleep, how yes, we want to look at how many hours you're in sleep, but we also want to look at all the other habits when it comes to sleep. What are you doing leading up to sleep? Are you staying consistent with your sleep and wake times? Do you have those cute kind of sleep variables dialed in? A cool room, as dark as possible, some sort of white noise? Are you winding down before bed versus just getting into bed? We want to make sure all those things are dialed in. Are we getting the right light exposure in terms of more light earlier in the day, less blue light at night, things like that, right? And again, just because you sleep 6 to 8 hours doesn't mean it's necessarily good sleep. We have to look at those things. And then also you have the unfortunate thing of sleep apnea, which you need to look out for. And that's definitely something that probably impacts more people than they think. And so that can definitely, even though you're sleeping for 6 to 8 hours, that can just wreck your sleep quality, right? I think most people, there's at least 2 to 3 low-hanging fruit things that they can do from a sleep perspective to get that dialed in, even if you sleep 6 to 8 hours there. Here's the thing. A lot of people are like, I feel pretty good when I wake up. But to me, what I've noticed is poor sleep becomes our baseline. And so that's like our new normal. And that's what we're coming from, right? When we can start to dial in these other habits, that gets better. So this is a sneaky thing. And I don't know if I mentioned this, but again, they didn't necessarily eat more at meals, but they snacked more throughout the day. And that frequent grazing drove up total daily calories without realizing it. We're looking at 200 to 300 more calories per day. So again, you're maybe not necessarily going to eat more at your meals, but you're going to just passively eat more throughout the day. And 200 to 300 calories, that's going to be the difference between you being in a deficit and you being at maintenance. So that can really add up. And so if you feel like you're eating pretty well, but not seeing results, this could be part of it. And so 3 kind of takeaways for me from this study that I want to hope you get into a better position is prioritize quality sleep, right? That's going to help regulate hunger and cravings. And again, we want to get that 6 to 8 hours, but we also want to set ourselves up for good sleep, like I just talked about there. This is also why I'm a huge fan of sticking to structured meals. These meals outside of the structured meals are the extra calories that sneak up on you, right? Oh, hey, I'm only eating 1,500 calories. Why am I stuck? But you're not logging the snacks that you're randomly having throughout the day that you're grazing on, right? And so this is a big reason why I preach setting up a certain number of meals per day, and then you stick to those, right? But now you're at least aware that when sleep is off, you may subconsciously eat more calories without realizing it. So that's like an easy place to look. But again, this is why I just think having, hey, 4 meals per day, that's the only time you're eating. Again, that's easier said than done, but I think if we can start to do that and you can stick to that for multiple weeks on end, you'll start to see some good progress there. And lastly, don't ignore the little things, right? They're often really what explains why progress is stalled. So again, definitely look at this and just see, hey, maybe there's a little bit more snacking coming into my day there. So third study is the time of day of food intake influences overall intake in humans. But the results suggest that low energy density intake during any portion of the day can reduce overall intake. So now we're talking about the lower the energy density of the food, you're probably going to consume less calories. So lower energy density would be like for any given amount of food, it has less calories than say something else. So like a good example would be like a vegetable versus an Oreo, right? The same serving or the same amount of grams of a vegetable is going to be far less calories than the same amount of grams of Oreos, right? The Oreos are going to be higher energy dense. And intake in the morning is particularly satiating and can reduce the total amount ingested for the day. And that intake in the late night lacks satiating value and can result in greater overall daily intake there. Obviously, the main thing that we can focus on here is lower energy density foods. That's going to take care of a lot of these things. But again, if we can eat more earlier in the day, it seems to be a little bit more satiating when you are eating more earlier in the day. And then the later you eat meals in the day, the less satiating they are. So and this was an observational study, right? So there's other things that could be at play here. But what it sounds like is there's this natural tendency to be hungrier at night, just as being a human, right? So again, if we understand that, we can start to maybe piece together, okay, there's not necessarily anything wrong with me. This is just how I'm hardwired. And again, now you're aware of it and you can make the necessary adjustments that you need to. So a few things, as I've mentioned, like I feel like there's this overlooked factor in body composition in terms of just an overemphasis on calories. I've kind of talked about that a lot more recently. I think my episode that actually just came out today on 515, I think it was episode 597. It's like why eating more, why eating less advice is not necessarily the full picture. We need to look into it more, right? And so again, to come back to this whole kind of thing of just like calories in, calories out, again, that is true, but how we partition these, when we eat those calories, what they're made up of, our current like nutrient status, these are all things that are going to impact things, right? And so again, in this observational study, they found that one, satiety was lower later in the day. So we just naturally had less satiety for any given meal later in the day. People consume more calories as the day went on. So it was like, is it the satiety or is that just the habitual thing? But we have to understand here now that people are going to consume more calories later at night, but our satiety is lower later at night. So now we're more likely to overconsume calories. And then on top of it, not only did people consume more calories as the day progressed? One thing that tended to happen is meal frequency increased as the day went on. So people started to eat more often as the day went on. So again, the result of this is a higher likelihood of eating more calories overall. So in this first chart, people tended to eat larger meals later in the day. So between 6 and 10 a.m. They have the mean meal size, and the numbers are 1, 1.5 to 2.5. In the first meal, or between 6 and 10, it was a little over 1.5 there. From 10 a.m. to, sorry, they have this in military time, to 2 p.m., I was closer to 2.5. Between 2 p.m. and was that 6 p.m. was again 2.5. And then between 6 p.m. and 10 p.m., it was closer to 3. And then between 10 p.m. 12 a.m., it was right under 2, which makes sense, right? So again, we already tend to eat larger meals. And then again, satiety was lower as the day went on. Like in this graph here, it just trended down throughout the day, like a clear trend down. However, it did seem to come up a little bit at that like 10 p 12 a.m. mark. And then again, people tended to eat more frequently as the day went on. In this graph, there's like this, okay, after meal interval in terms of minutes, it was closer to 300. And then as it really went on, there was, again, I don't know if I'm explaining this very well here, but again, as the day went on, like there was a shorter time in between each meal, so people would eat more meals more often, right? So again, I think to me, what this means is meal timing matters more than people think, right? While total calorie intake is important, when and how you eat can influence hunger, energy levels, and overall intake, right? How do I approach the whole kind of concept of meal timing? I think one thing we can do is we can start the day with a high protein meal to improve satiety and energy, right? We want to include protein in every meal to regulate hunger and maintain muscle. We're really going to run into issues, especially as the day goes on. We know that we're working against how we're hardwired. We're going to feel less satiated for every little bit that we eat. So protein is very satiating. So we want to make sure that we're still getting protein in each meal to help reduce that. We want to stick to consistent meal timing, same number of meals around the same time each day. You don't have to eat exactly at the same time, but hey, breakfast is between 6 and 8. Lunch is between 11 and 1. Midday pre-workout snack is between 2 and 4. And then dinner is at between 6 and 8, right? We want to have something like that. Acknowledge that hunger is typically higher at night. So we want to focus on lower energy density foods at night, proteins, veggies, etc., to prevent overeating. And we just probably want to get some nutrition in around our workouts. Those are going to be the main things that we're going to try and work on there. So that's how I approach a meal timing with clients. So to me, those are 3 very applicable studies that we can implement into our day, and they're going to be super helpful, right? Now, there's one that I want to go over that I would say isn't necessarily applicable right now, but it's just very interesting to me and something to keep an eye out on. A study from Rosen et al. In 2024, I think it's still preprint. I don't know if they actually updated it or not, but basically the title is High Dose Dietary Vitamin D Allocates a Surplus of Calories to Muscle and Growth Instead of Fat via Modulation of Myostatin and Leptin Signaling, okay? So study design, this was conducted in mice. They were given very high doses of vitamin D. So that's, again, one kind of limitation of the study is it's in animals, right? This isn't human data. So they were given very high doses of vitamin D, then they were overfed, right? So they were in a caloric surplus, and they compared effects of high versus normal vitamin D on body composition. So the mice with high vitamin D levels gain more lean mass and they gain less fat. The hormonal mechanisms proposed were lower leptin, which meant better energy partitioning there, and then lower myostatin, so more muscle growth. So real quick, myostatin essentially inhibits muscle growth. From my understanding, it's a mechanism so that we don't get just super muscular. And somebody may hear that and be like, why? That doesn't make any sense. Muscle is very energy demanding. And again, if we think evolutionarily speaking, we didn't have this abundance of energy around. And yes, we need muscle to do basic bodily functions, but anything more than that is not a good use of energy. Right? Because people back in when we were evolving, again, maybe we didn't, before the internet, before you could actually look at yourself in the mirror, it's like people really didn't care they didn't care about their physique, right? At least I would imagine they didn't. It was more about, hey, we just need to freaking find some food to eat and we need to somehow figure out how to reproduce. And that's literally all that they cared about during that time, right? So again, muscle was just something that our body didn't need. And so now obviously things are flipped. People care about how they look and we have plenty of energy around. So like muscle is something that is a good idea to have now. But in saying that, like with anything, too much of something is not going to be great as well too, right? So even in today's modern environment, like too much muscle wouldn't necessarily be a good thing either, right? It's like you can get super extreme with it, right? And just because again, a larger body probably is, from a longevity standpoint, it's probably not going to be as good as a body that's at a normal weight, right? And so this is even with BMI. It's like body comp dependent, like being super high on BMI probably is not a great thing from like a long-term health standpoint, right? But again, there's layers to this. It's not just, oh, hey, you're overweight, that's bad. And it's not like you are super jacked and that's bad. It's again, just like we're talking extreme levels here, which typically are not going to be achievable without performance enhancing drugs. And again, we can thank myostatin for that, right? So it inhibits muscle growth. So if we have lower myostatin, we don't have that inhibition of muscle growth there. Interestingly enough, if you ever seen a picture like a super jacked dog, I believe they're like whippets, and then Belgian blue bull, I think is what it is. Like those are like, look those up, and they have myostatin deficiency, right? So they don't have that thing that inhibits muscle growth. And now here's the thing: serum levels in mice reached 150 to 200 ng, which is way above like typical human reference ranges, right? Like I think the Western medical range is like 30 to 100. And I think if we want to go like the more functional route, we're probably looking at closer to 50 to 80-ish, somewhere around there, 40 to 80, kind of is that sweet spot that you want to be at. So again, too much is not good, which we'll talk about here in a minute. So let's talk about this. Human application is not direct, right? Supraphysiological doses were used. And again, we need to be careful with that, which I'll talk about in a little bit. Again, mice models don't always translate, and we don't have studies showing this effect in humans. So again, we need to look at that, right? And again, the risk of mega dosing vitamin D in humans, toxicity, calcium imbalance, et cetera. These are all things that can happen when we have too much vitamin D. And so vitamin D's role is more likely to support a favorable environment for body comp changes and not drive it alone. So like, you don't listen to this and be like, oh, I just need to up my vitamin D, because there are some risks with doing that. So definitely like you need to know what your vitamin D levels are, right? And most people don't know that. So we need to look at that. Common deficiency or suboptimal levels are going to be like in winter, or if you just have an indoor lifestyle. And so again, we want to test it. We want to aim for that healthy range, right? We don't necessarily want to go above that, just because again, we don't have the data on this. So how to optimize without mega dosing, moderate supplementation, right? Depending on where you're at, getting outside, and then vitamin D rich foods, fatty fish, fortified foods, etc. To round this up, do not mega dose based on this, okay? It was done in mice and we need more human data, but I just thought it was super interesting and something that we could potentially look out for in the future, right there. But I think one of the main things it does highlight is how nutrient status can influence body composition. So again, this comes back to what I talked about, where people have this very calories in, calories out viewpoint. And I just think that's somewhat reductionist, and we need to look into things more. And your nutrient status is super important, right? These are things like under the hood that I've really been trying to talk about here in the last couple of months. So for now, I think the big thing being, just make sure you're not vitamin D deficient. Check that out. And again, if you are someone that is inside a lot, you don't really get a lot of sun, I think supplementing 1 to 5,000 IUs is not a bad idea. But in saying that, you need to go get yours checked out so you can check it out, right? So it was just an interesting study there. But that's it for today's episode. Hopefully these were helpful. Let me know, give me some feedback on this. If you found this podcast to be helpful in any way, if you could leave a rating and review, that will help more people find it. If you haven't yet, give me a follow on Instagram, Jeff, HOEHN_, and that's where I'm most active on social media. That's it for this episode. Talk to you guys soon.